The press room at the White House was packed. Reporters shuffled in their seats, murmuring among themselves as they prepared for yet another press briefing. Cameras flashed, laptops were open, and news anchors readied their questions. The anticipation in the air was almost tangible. But today there was a different kind of tension, because today they weren't just dealing with any press secretary, they were dealing with Karoline Leavitt. At just 27 years old, she was the youngest person to ever hold the position of White House press secretary. She had been underestimated from day one, dismissed by political analysts and journalists alike. They called her too inexperienced, too young, a mouthpiece for Trumpism, but in just a few short months, she had proven them wrong. Her composure was unshakable, her words razor-sharp, and her ability to handle the press borderline legendary. And today, she was about to prove it again. The doors at the front of the room swung open, and Karoline walked in, her expression unreadable, her pace measured. She stepped up to the podium with calm confidence. The reporters quieted down. She adjusted the microphone slightly and scanned the crowd. She could already see the setup coming. A trap was waiting. She could tell by the way the reporters were leaning forward, eager, expectant. They had been waiting for this moment, a chance to trip her up, to put her on the defensive, to catch her in a misstep. And at the center of it all was Ethan Caldwell, a senior political correspondent for a major liberal news network. He sat at the front, his notebook already open, his pen tapping against the desk. He was known for his aggressive questioning, his loaded accusations, and his ability to corner press secretaries into uncomfortable moments. But today, he had no idea who he was up against. Karoline took a breath. Game on. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice smooth and composed. "We have a few updates today, and then I'll take your questions." She went through her prepared remarks with precision, touching on policy updates, diplomatic meetings, and economic reports. But she could see it in their eyes. The press was waiting for their moment, and the moment came faster than expected. The second she finished, Ethan Caldwell shot up his hand. Karoline smiled internally. "Of course it's him." She gave a small nod. "Ethan." Caldwell stood, adjusting his tie, already wearing a smug smirk. The room stilled. The cameras zoomed in. "Ms. Leavitt," he started, his voice dripping with condescension, "given your relatively short experience in government, do you truly believe you are qualified to stand at that podium and speak on behalf of an administration that handles some of the most complex international and domestic challenges in history?" Silence. A few reporters exchanged glances. Some even grinned, as if they already knew that Karoline would struggle to answer. Karoline's expression didn't change. She didn't blink, didn't flinch. She had been waiting for this moment. She tilted her head slightly as if considering his words carefully. Then she struck. "Well, Ethan," she said smoothly, "I assume you're asking because you hold every journalist in this room to the same standard, correct?" Caldwell blinked. Karoline continued. "You, for example, you cover international politics. Can you remind us all what your first-hand experience is in handling diplomacy?" Caldwell opened his mouth, then closed it. Karoline didn't let him recover. "Or perhaps," she continued, feigning curiosity, "we should discuss your military strategy expertise. Since you report on defense matters, I'm sure you've led operations, commanded troops, and advised generals?" The room erupted into hushed murmurs. Karoline's gaze remained steady. "No? Interesting." Caldwell shifted uncomfortably. Karoline leaned forward slightly. "The reason you and every journalist in this room are qualified to report on these issues," she said, "is because your job is to ask the right questions, analyze the information, and deliver the truth to the American people." Her tone never wavered. "My job is no different." Silence. Caldwell cleared his throat, trying to regain his footing. "That's not—" But Karoline wasn't finished. "You seem very concerned with my qualifications, Ethan," she said, her voice cool. "And yet, you don't seem to hold the previous press secretaries to the same standard." Caldwell's face turned red. Karoline smiled faintly. "Funny how that works." A few gasps. A camera zoomed in on Caldwell's reaction. He stammered, flipping through his notes, looking for a comeback. Karoline tilted her head again. "Would you like to ask an actual question now, Ethan?" The room erupted. A few reporters even chuckled. Caldwell muttered something under his breath and sat down. His usual smug arrogance was gone. Karoline gave a professional smile and moved on. Next question. The press scrambled. Suddenly, everyone wanted to speak. Ethan Caldwell had walked into this briefing thinking he would destroy Karoline Leavitt. Instead, she had just ended his credibility on live television. And she wasn't even close to finished. The tension in the room was still thick. Ethan Caldwell sat back in his chair, visibly irritated, while other reporters looked at each other, unsure whether to feel secondhand embarrassment or take notes on how Karoline Leavitt had just dismantled him. Twice. Karoline, however, acted as though nothing had happened. She turned back to Angela Martinez, who, to her credit, had remained professional despite the disruption. As I was saying, Karoline repeated smoothly, picking up exactly where she left off, our administration is focused on balancing security with humane policies, and here's what that looks like. She laid out the key points, her voice steady, her message clear. The room gradually relaxed, but there was an undercurrent of energy, the kind that only came when someone completely changed the momentum of a situation and took control. When she finished, Angela nodded appreciatively and jotted down notes. "Thank you," Angela said. Karoline nodded, giving her a small but professional smile. Next question. A few seconds passed before another journalist, Daniel Reeves, from a well-known political magazine, hesitantly raised his hand. Unlike Caldwell, Daniel was measured, experienced, and strategic, not someone who asked questions for the sake of a viral clip. Karoline called on him. "Ms. Leavitt," he began, "there's been some criticism that this administration focuses too much on defending itself from media narratives instead of addressing direct policy concerns. How would you respond to those who say this approach is more about political positioning than real solutions?" A thoughtful question. Karoline gave an approving nod. "That's an important question, Daniel," she said, acknowledging his professionalism. "And I think it speaks to a bigger issue." She let that sink in for a moment before continuing. "Policy and politics are two different things, but in Washington, people tend to blur the lines to push an agenda. Our administration understands that. Just like in this very room, people will always try to control the narrative, but our job is to focus on facts, results, and the American people, and that's exactly what we're doing." Daniel nodded, seeming satisfied with her answer. But as Karoline scanned the room for the next question, she noticed Caldwell leaning forward again. She knew exactly what was coming. He wasn't done. His pride had taken too big of a hit, and now he was desperate to regain control of the situation. "Ms. Leavitt," Caldwell called out, his voice sharper now, "if you're so concerned with the facts, why does this administration consistently refuse to take responsibility for its failures?" The room went quiet again. Karoline turned toward him, her expression unreadable. "I'm sorry, Ethan," she said, feigning confusion. "Could you clarify which specific failures you're referring to?" Caldwell straightened. "Take the recent diplomatic tensions." "Ah," Karoline cut in smoothly. "So we're shifting from border security to international relations now?" A few reporters chuckled quietly. Caldwell's jaw tightened, but he pushed forward. "You dodge questions every time there's a controversy," he accused. "The American people deserve accountability." Karoline let a beat pass. Then she smiled. It was subtle, calculated. "Ethan," she said slowly, "accountability is exactly why we're here today. I stand here, every single day, in front of all of you, taking your questions, facing scrutiny, addressing concerns." She let that sink in for a moment. "That's more than I can say for some members of the media," she added. The tension cracked. A few gasps, a few raised eyebrows, a few quick glances towards certain reporters who had been noticeably absent when tough questions came their way. Karoline continued before anyone could recover. "Since we're discussing accountability, let's talk about journalistic responsibility as well. Because when misinformation spreads, when facts are twisted, and when narratives are crafted for clicks instead of truth, it doesn't just hurt one administration or one leader, it hurts the country." The room felt heavier now. Caldwell leaned forward slightly, but for the first time, he looked hesitant. Karoline held his gaze. "So, Ethan," she said, her voice quieter but even more powerful, "if you want to talk about accountability, let's make sure it applies to everyone in this room." Dead silence. Caldwell's lips pressed into a thin line. A few reporters avoided eye contact. One of the younger journalists scribbled notes furiously, knowing this moment would be replayed everywhere. Karoline let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of her words to settle. Then, with effortless grace, she turned away from Caldwell. Next question. This time, when the hands went up, Caldwell didn't even try to interrupt. For the remainder of the briefing, Karoline handled every question flawlessly, giving concise, fact-driven responses. The room had started with the press trying to corner her, but she had turned the tables completely. By the time she wrapped up, standing tall at the podium, there was no doubt. Karoline Leavitt had just dominated the press briefing. She gathered her notes, gave a polite nod to the reporters, and exited the room without another glance at Caldwell. As soon as the door closed behind her, the murmurs exploded. Caldwell sat there, his face flushed, his notebook left untouched on the desk in front of him. A younger reporter leaned toward Daniel Reeves and whispered, "Did that just happen?" Daniel exhaled, shaking his head with a small smirk. "Yeah," he muttered. "And she made it look easy." Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that inspire and challenge us to grow. What would you have done if you were in her shoes? Let us know in the comments below.